Hello, everyone. Welcome to EROSS 2020, the ER Online Summer Seminar Series. This is an event, as we've been meeting every Wednesday here. This is a series of events featuring world-class researchers in the area of conceptual modeling and adjacent areas. An event connected to the Bolzano Summer of Knowledge and the ER 2020 conference. So this conference that has 4 decades of tradition in conceptual modeling. ER this year was planned to be held in Vienna in the first week of November, but for obvious reasons will be organized as an online conference, so please check the ER website for details. The papers which have been accepted this year have just been announced, but very interesting papers, but the deadlines for a series of very interesting workshops is next week, so there's still time to submit papers for the ER workshops. Ontologies are on the path that leads from the observation of the world to the creation of database and the development of information systems. The traditional system modeling approach forced the modeler to mentally map concepts acquired from the real world to instances of abstractions available in his paradigm of choice. This mapping introduces inconsistencies and inaccuracies that inevitably lead to conflicts between the user's concepts and the abstractions captured by the conceptual model. The basic reason is the lack of an initial agreement between user and modeler on the concepts of the real world. Such an agreement could be established by means of an ontology. So this text comes from a paper written almost 20 years ago by our guest and colleagues. I'm very, very happy to welcome here today Gilberto Camara. He is the Secretariat Director of the Group on Earth Observations, GEO, which is a partnership of more than 110 governments connected to the United Nations. Gilberto was formerly the former director of Brazil's National Center for Spatial Research, where he led extremely important work on data transparency, in particular related to surveillance and monitoring of the Amazon deforestation. He has done, so the text that I just mentioned, as I said, it's a paper that was written 20 years ago, and this was pioneer seminal work in the application of ontologies in geoinformation systems. So he's a very, very well-respected and important scientist. He received many important awards, including the NASA Becquerel Award, the Global Citizen Award for Global Spatial Data Infrastructure, among many others, a doctoral honoris causa from the University of Münster in Germany. So, but it's one of those scientists that not only does important scientific work, but actually puts that into practice, and in this case, literally at a global scale. One of the problems and challenge that we as a society, as a global society, have to address. So I'm very, very happy to welcome today Gilberto Camara. Gilberto, thank you for being here and welcome to EROSS.
Thank you, and Giancarlo, and I'm delighted to be in touch with a community which I've always felt part of, not being currently active on it, but really to understand the importance of such community, which I've seen from many, many, many years. And the more I work on my area and try to reach out to applications in the global problems, the more I understand the need for very important conceptual research and research on ontologies. So the talk I'm presenting to you today has this title, Ontological Issues on Big Earth Observation Data Analysis. And you can access it by Zenodo, and after the talk, I mean, this will be available on the EROSS website, but also on my website, gilbertocamara.org. So let me start by thinking I don't know one does research in a vacuum. These are my research team at INPE Brazil, so I still keep still part of a research team of a lot of people, very talented, established researchers, postdocs, to which I thank you very much. Now, the background for what we're going to talk today is the issue that concerns us all about sustainable development. We have two parts of what we would call sustainable development. One is knowledge, what we as scientists understand about our planet and about the limits of our planet. And the other is action, how societies decide to use our planet's resources. And of course, knowledge is important, but without society taking action, we will never achieve an equilibrium between nature and society. Now, behind all this, these are tremendous efforts at all levels by many scientists in complete disciplines. So I'm going to take this as a microcosm of what we do on Earth observation in order for you to understand how best to transform this knowledge into action. So it's funny because one of the discussions I'm having always with Giancarlo, with Nicola, with other members is the work ontology important? And I was discussing this today with my co-staff members at the Geo Secretariat, who of course is linked to applications, and one of us lead scientists, Ian Jarvis, who does work on agriculture. He said, no, ontologies are important. I'm quoting him. Ontology aims to reduce the complexity of nature so a limited intellect can try to understand the Earth's environment. And this is not coming from a professor in the ivory tower. This comes from someone who is deeply in front of trying to push implications about understanding food security, food production in developing countries. So it's very much aware of the need for really pushing ontology into this, let's say, the mindset of those that use Earth observation. Now, let me start from just a couple of minutes talking about basic concept on geospatial ontology, which might be familiar to some of you, but not so familiar to others. One of the crucial bits of geospatial ontology is that it's all about, it starts with observations of the world. So the famous question, what's out there? And obviously, as you all ER people and ontology people know, we use words in our language to describe the world. But as you know, this description is only approximate. So let's start from what we do in Earth observation, which is we measure values in locations in space-time. These are buoys on the ocean. These are real buoys. This is a location of these buoys. We could also measure them by satellites, and what we have to do after we observe, we try to come up with a model of nature. So we, of course, from observations, for example, derive some maps, and actually their data on sea surface temperature. So in the geospatial ontology parlance, we refer to these as fields, which is a space-time function, continuous function, that assigns a unique value to any location in your space-time cube. So in this case, it's the Earth's ocean. And at any point, you're supposed to, by inference, interpolation, and modeling, you say, okay, there is the sea surface temperature at this particular date in every place of the global ocean. So you see that this is the first two concepts we talked about, the observations and fields. And the third concept, which is very much used on geospatial ontology, is the notion of objects, which is like objects is free for all, but in terms of geospatial ontologies, there has been some agreement on what we mean by this. Of course, they're constructs, that we use in language. They're built upon our observations of the world. And of course, they require an external reality, Mont Blanc, or whatever, Germany, the sun, the moon, and a conscious act to identify their experience. So one of the issues that it's important here is the notion of identity. So in order to become an object, you must be unique. The object must be unique and distinguishable from others. Now, there is already a strong literature on the basis of objects, and the most accepted, not unique, but most accepted view comes from the work of Barry Smith at the University of Buffalo, who has done a substantial work on geospatial ontologies. And Barry came with the distinction between what he called fiat and bona fide ontologies. A fiat object is one defined by legal agreements and treaties and normally accepted circumstances. So there's a legal aspect to it, which is the ones that we agree based on, for example, the Länder in Germany. And the bona fide object is an object which we consider it to be an object. There is no such thing as, let's say, there's multiple definitions of how you calculate, for example, the diameter of the sun. Sun is a star, and there are multiple ways to calculate the diameter where it's included, but we mostly agree there is an object out there we can call the sun, and there's only one for the moment, and we agree that it has a certain boundary where the sun ends and finishes, even though this is really not legally agreed, but an approximation. So now when we talk about natural objects and the identification of natural objects, we really have to include both a model of reality, either physical or mental, and an agreement which is socially constructed. So Mont Blanc, where does Mont Blanc start? Where does the Dôme de Goûter end? This is obviously some socially accepted name for something we agree to exist on nature. And therefore, this act distinguishes objects which are from nature, that objects which are built out of human conventions, for example, boundaries between counties, boundaries between land properties, and so on. So the work I mostly do has to do with natural objects. And they are all approximations. I'm sure most of you have read or heard of the famous paper by Mandelbrot, which he asks, what is the size of the coast of England? And the obvious answer is, if you talk about, think about it for a moment, it says it depends. I was talking about that natural objects are always boundaries of natural objects, where they are, where is exactly the boundaries of a typhoon or a mountain or an iceberg or the coast of England. They are just approximations. So, for example, the size of the coast of England is something that depends on how one actually does the measurement. If you go counting, walking step by step along the coast of England, you're going to measure differently than if you measure by satellite, for example. And finally, to sort of put geospatial concepts in a nutshell, the other very much agreed upon concept is an event. So this is an actual, let's say, road sign in the United States, and it strikes to you there's something wrong here. Dust storms might exist, because you would think dust storms may occur, but not exist. And because now time is, if we consider now objects not, let's say, static, but changing and dynamic with time, then we introduce a final concept on this very basic general geospatial ontology, which is an event. So we used to say that objects exist and events occur. So we say, for example, Mount Etna was an object and Etna's 2002 eruption was an event. And an event is, while an object is supposed to have an identity that is persistent over time, an object has an identity which is persistent over time. An event is something which is bounded in time. So there is, hopefully, a measured start and the end of the eruption. The same thing for the tsunami in Japan. Japan is an object, but the Tohoku tsunami was an event which actually devastated Japan enormously, which consequences are still seen today. So just putting it all together on this Geospatial Ontology 101, we have come up with, this is the minimal set of concepts, the idea there is an external reality. We observe this external reality with satellites, with in situ, with our eyes. We, in some cases, transform this, represent this by continuous functions or continuous representation, even continuous mental representations. And out of those, we extract objects. And objects also are associated in time to things that happen to them, like events. So just to take this is Mount Cotopaxi in Ecuador. It's an object, or at least we agree that it exists, whatever the case is. It sits on top of a mountain ridge, which is the Andes, which is a field. And it's last exploded in August 2015, which is an event. Note that object and field are usually defined mostly in a temporal way, whereas event is a concept which is bounded in time, and that's where some of the discussions get interesting. So this is, let's say, Geospatial Ontology 101. Now we consider the other side, the vision, the conception which pervades those that use observations of the Earth. And it's a perverse conception because we consider that normally in this case we divide the world in small cells, maybe depending on the resolution of the data, 10 meter, 30 meter, 200 meters. And we assign a single class to one cell, so we give a label, a name, and we assume there is a correct classification, and we assume there is an ideal. So there are lots and lots of decisions, of conceptual decisions here. Many of them are not taken consciously. Just people just do it without thinking. They have a legend. Oh, there's, what's there? There's forest, there is water, there is whatever, savannas, there is agriculture, there are roads, there are settlements there. So you start by saying what's out there and you come up with some ideas what's out there. But more often than not, it's not the Mont Blanc story. You conceive your object, in this case, the Earth, represented by a set of cells, as having individuals which represent these kinds of land classes. It's a huge approximation, and we'll see that it's also a problematic one. One of the problems is we use two kinds of concepts which sometimes get conflated. Sometimes we talk about the cover of the land, and we refer to terms such as grasslands, so areas dominated by herbaceous vegetation. So this is like a definition of a grassland. But at the same time, this same grassland, this is the picture of the steppes in Asia, the same grassland is associated to pasture, because obviously there are animals here who are using this as feed. So planted, are they planted? But there's livestock grazing there. So the dualities here involve our temptation, which is everywhere, to capture the word in sometimes competitive ways, but still think that we can assign a unique label to each point of the planet. Now, this is obviously has gone forever. This is not something that is new by itself. Mapping has been a tradition since humans started, trying to occupy the Earth. What changed now is the issue of what we call, for the lack of a better word, the new digital economy. Now, data services, social networks, the fact that you have data, lots of data in your fingertips by, having a device such as a smartphone, which accesses maps, which accesses Wikipedia, which accesses whatever, social networks, and so on. And this is where a lot of investment and a lot of effort, including a lot of effort in information technology, is taking place. You don't know this, the social networks, sensors, lots of images. And the question that I would like to share with you is this massive data sets affecting our, let's say, reasoning, our ontological, our semantic reasoning about the world, and how do we conceive the world as we have more and more data? And my contention here on this talk would be yes. But first, we have to listen to what is said now by many people, which is the story of about the end of theory. The data deluge makes the scientific method obsolete. You probably have all seen this famous piece by Chris Anderson and Wired, instead of the famous quote by statistician George Box that says, all models are wrong, but some are useful. Google says all models are wrong, and increasingly you can succeed without them. Now, does Google claim that we can succeed without modeling? Can this claim be tested and evaluated objectively when we talk about nature? Because this is the astronomer royal, Sir Martin Rees. Sir Martin Rees has stated in a recent opinion piece that he wrote on this very interesting online magazine called Aeon. He wrote something which I like very much. He says, black holes are simpler than force, and science has its limits. Why does he say black holes are simpler than force? In the end, black holes obey physical laws, which have been established by general relativity, Einstein and his followers, and by and large, these equations that describe black holes have been verified. Recently, we had the famous event of detection of gravitational waves. In forests, the complexity is much bigger because we don't have a general law of forests. We have approximation of description of forests done by scientists worldwide trying to understand a completely varied and complex ecosystem. Therefore, when we now deal with the big data, in my case, it's going to be big Earth observation data, we start saying, does this change our thinking? What is the impact in terms of what I do, what one does in conceptual modeling of spatial information by big data? What does it change? Does it change anything? Does it move us somewhere from the tradition that we talked about, objects and fields and so on? Do we need research? Is there research avenues there? And to understand better the question, we have to compare what would be the ideal model that at least some of us consider to be the ideal model of data analysis, what happens in reality. Those that work a lot of conceptual modeling would say you first need, first of all, to consider external reality and to derive some sort of ontology or some sort of semantic description to understand what you're going to find. And then only after that you understand very well, perhaps by many interactions, what you're going to find, you do a classification. Now, this is what we would call a super, informational view. But what happens in practice is not this. What happens in practice is the data science community actually relies on measurements as proxies. So they have, instead of designing forest, they say, I'm measuring what is a forest. So you have samples of forest or samples of corn or samples of water, whatever. You organize these samples in the data and you run a machine learning model. So a lot of the analysis is done purely by sampling the world and considering that let's say the numerical view is sufficient to capture the complexity of the world. And this, of course, comes from success of applications which we can call have been successful. So the famous applications in Google that you can distinguish cats from dogs, or the fact that now computers can play Go and chess at the level that surpasses world champions. There's a great success in automatic translation. Does this also work for big spatial data? And to understand that, one has to do some work. So some of what I'm going to present to you is actually the result of, dirty boots in the work of taking satellite data, organizing data in data cubes, which essentially are space-time fields. Basically, it's a collection of data that describes a certain point in space, Switzerland, according to many instances of time. And then you do some machine learning. Right. Advantages. What's the good side? The good side of this is that this is some paper I co-wrote with others in the Conference of Spatial Information Theory 2001. And what we said that yes, of course, a remote sensing image is a measurement that captures snapshots of change trajectories. So instead of searching for the content for the object on these images, we should be searching for changes. What is changing? What dynamics take importance over the simple measurement of objects? And therefore, instead of just looking at one image at a time, we look at the series, especially we take time series, for example, to understand what are these changes that are measured. But to do that, of course, we need some, in case lots of understanding of what is actually happening. A time series is interesting because it allows us, for example, there are 3 time series here, and they are from these 3 points. So the top point is an area in Brazil who has been subject to agriculture. And what you see on the y-axis is something called NDVI. NDVI is a vegetation index. The greener the area, the stronger the NDVI. The browner the area, just for approximation, the weaker the NDVI. So a point there has seasonal variation is very much likely attributed to a crop. Whereas a point which mostly green or around these spikes that you see on the middle are mostly due to noise, but the signal is pretty much consistent as high vegetation, which is normally associated for forest. Now we're starting to get better, and instead of thinking only about objects, but thinking about events and change. So we discussed this as lens change trajectories. the transformations of the land due to actions of land use. So we start being able to put together the dynamics and the initiator of dynamics, the continuous monitoring of landscapes. We can use that. These data sets, the first, of course, use is the traditional one. You estimate what is the land cover change. So you say, okay, I'm going to take the time series, train a machine learning model, classify all time series, and this is like done in an ad hoc way in terms of what is there. Right, fine. What do you find out? Well, you find out that it works. Works in the sense that you produce data. Now, you produce maps. These are 2 papers produced with this kind of technique. One published in Nature Scientific Data, the other published on the Land Journal. One discussing the maps themselves, the other one analyzing what the maps tell us about soybean and pasture as causing deforestation. Fine. Fine. Now, if life could be easy all the time, then it would be beautiful. But nature is not easy all the time. So I'm going to give you an example of a very interesting region, which is the Brazilian Cerrado. It's a savanna, it's a specific type of savanna that covers a huge area in Brazil, 2 million square kilometers, ranging from 5 degrees south to 25 degrees south, covering basically all the South Tropical Zone. Lots of diversity there. Now, researchers have tried to capture this diversity in different ways. The most obvious way is giving names. Giving names is saying, okay, this is an open cerrado. So one of the pictures is an open cerrado, and the same is a cerrado stricto sensu, and the other one is a cerradão, as we say in Brazil, which is a dense woodland. The bottom figure tells you what is the motivation for this kind of naming, is essentially saying, well, there's a vegetation gradient here, continuous vegetation gradient of how much trees and how much biomass and how many vegetation is, how dense is the vegetation. And depending on this, I am going to call them by names. I call them by savanna, woodland, or dense, whatever, or shrubbery grassland. I put names. As you see, these names are approximations to reality. Then we start with the interesting problem that what we find in the data is not necessarily what we find in reality. And if you don't, and then there is this illusion which is born out of machine learning models. Machine learning is very good to give you an illusion. Why? Because you pick up a lot of some samples for example, for Amazonia or from area, and these machine learning models, if you validate them, they give you a false sense of security. By themselves, validation is a technical term that means fivefold means you take all your samples and you slice them in 4 parts. You use 80% of them to test your model and 20% to classify. Then you switch to some other 20% and you take the rest of the models to do that, and you so on and 5 times so that you switch to the data. But it is always give you fantastic results. Do they represent reality? And what we found out, that's not the case. These numbers are hugely overstated what you get. Because what happens here on machine learning is that it relies on optimization. It works very well with simple problems, spaces of cats and dogs. In mathematical terms, you can think about surfaces of small variability, cats and dog spaces, contrasted with surfaces of large variability, which of course nature that is different everywhere a little bit, which are particularly hard for machine learning. And therefore, a pure machine learning approach gives you a false pretense of quality, but in fact, you might really underestimate what goes on. And I'm speaking from experience. This is not something I read on papers. This is something I faced in real life. Because the machine learning is very good mathematically to do what we call an overfitting. You know, if you take balls and crosses here, knots and crosses, the best fit would be something like the middle surface that separates the knots and the crosses, where in the machine learning you have a tendency to overfit, and that's completely crazy. So there's an elephant in the room, literally, which is concepts and the understanding of the ecology are fundamental to train good models. You have to understand the niceties and the differences and the different types of what I am measuring. So if this is not done with extreme understanding of different ecological systems, your machine learning models will be, well, they will, you think you get a good result, but in practice you don't. When you go to examine the actual data, your result is still missing a lot of important differences. So this is really a, let's say, a lesson for those who think that you can basically crunch some data and produce some results without strong concepts. And that, for Earth observation, is not the case. So one simple example here, let me take this one. So what we did here is to pick up 60,000 samples from the Cerrado region of Brazil, and then cluster them using a self-organizing map. The details are not important. What is important is that the hard blue here is a points that have been associated with double cropping, soy plus corn. And there is one point here who is an outlier, and we thought, well, this point is wrong. And then we went to examine and became interested by the fact that in this area where the magenta points are, which is about 15 degrees south, more or less, the climatological parameters are such that you have a neat season of soy going up and corn going up, so a strong region. Whereas this yellow, orange samples come from a different region, about 7 degrees south, and where the second crop is not so strong due to differences in water availability, climate, and so on. So you see that I give a name to the same class, soy, corn, but in fact, these are two different data sets which respond differently to the local conditions. And therefore, I need to understand them better. And that's, it's hard to do it if you don't know, if you're don't either you yourself or you work on a team which doesn't understand what are the ecological differences leading to the differences in agricultural practices. So you perhaps know of this book. It's a very interesting book, which I like. It's the Big Book of Concepts. And Murphy on this Book of Concepts says the gradation of properties in the world that we just discussed means there are a smallish number of categories will never map perfectly into all objects. And I just gave you some examples of that. And some areas are particularly hard. Forest, very ambiguous. We talk about forest, but the forest may be a tropical forest, the forest may be a temperate forest, the forest may be a dry forest, the forest may be a planted forest. It's all about forests. So how do you disambiguate that? Furthermore, for us in Brazil, this is a very important question. When is a forest not a forest? What happens when you deforest? What's happening there? Again, we go back to the issue of time. And time captured on geospatial ontology by events. So we normally would prefer deforestation is not a property of an object, but an event that occurs in a certain place in time. So an area of forest starts being logged, then there is a fire, then there is a clear cut. So now we start saying, oh, I can only capture some kinds of important information about my land if I introduce time, if I introduce the concept of events. Without introducing the idea of events, I cannot understand how forest loss is occurring. So someone cuts some trees, and then the other guy goes there and puts a fire, and then takes some of the trees which remain until everything is clear cut and you put the cattle. So this is captured on this diagram here, which shows and this is a paper by Robin Chadson, and the paper is When is a Forest a Forest? It's a very nice paper. And essentially what the authors do is put one axis is time, the other axis is structural complexity. Not to make a long story short, trajectory 1 is where you have a forest which stays there, no one changes. Trajectory 2 is when you reduce at one go, the diversity of the forest, the complexity of the forest, you clean everything. And trajectory 3 is one where there is a disturbance in the forest, but because of some action, either law action against illegal logging or natural actions, things go back to the normal dynamics. And number 4 is when you have rehabilitation of an area that has been clear cut, and by time this area reverts to natural dynamics. So what's the message here? It's not, if we want to understand what happens to forests, especially what's happening to forests in a changing world, what happens to deforestation, time and concepts related to time have to be part of our ontologies. So we need to go back to the distinction between continuance, like an indigenous area, and occurrence, like a deforestation, to be able to construct ontologies of land change. And therefore, our ways of representing the data need to be able, for example, to extract events from time series. Time series is a time series, but how do I extract events? So I should be able to, for example, look at a time series, have some template of my events, and be able to extract these events from the time series. This is actually a couple of papers that one of my students produced recently. It's called, there's a name for it, but I'm happy to send you the details if you want. But essentially, the idea is that now events become, together with objects and field, first category elements on a conceptual view of the changing landscapes. And you have to put them there. You have to understand, okay, so a time series, well, this is a forest and then there was cut, this it went up again, so there's changing. This is a paper by Jan Verbessend in Wageningen University, where he and his co-authors aim to detect changes. Again, we're using the time series and the presentation of the landscape in time to detect changes that happen to the landscape. So I'm not going to go into much detail, just to tell you that instead of concepts, let's say purely static concepts, our ontologies, which are related to land use change, have to include concepts which, this is just initial discussion, but which includes things, what is a trajectory? What is a break? How can I label this trajectory? When is a forest degradation a type of label trajectory, and so on? There's a paper, I'm going to refer to it at the end of my talk, where you would find, just being published, where you find a bigger discussion than this. And with this kind of reasoning, I can start now. If I understand that events are important, then one can say, okay, what can I do with this idea? Well, for example, I can design what we call a spatial temporal calculus for reasoning about land use trajectories. So this is a paper published in the International Journal of Geographic Information Science, where we discuss, for example, what are the primitives that represents events on land use area? For example, how do you search for all forest locations where forest regrowth has occurred? For example, how do you search for all forest locations that have been converted into pasture? How do you search for forest locations that have evolved into double cropping? So we have a set of primitives, recur, convert, and evolve, that allow you to express queries for information that is produced by land use classification. Still, the idea of extracting meaningful events out of a time series of big data. And we can ask, for example, one example, very simple example is this one, where if you classify images one by one separately, this is an area in Brazil for 15 years of data, you do not consider recurring events. For example, we cannot, by looking at each of these data sets by itself, we cannot easily answer the question, if we don't consider the whole, say what areas have been cut and later abandoned and regrown as forest, or at least a secondary vegetation. And if we put all the data together, we can answer this question with the calculus and say, oh, all these areas here were areas that were forest, they were cut, they were put to use, they were abandoned, and some kind of vegetation grew back in time. And we can see how it has been evolved. And that is very important for land use policy. I'm not going to discuss it. Okay, so we come more or less to the end of the presentation. So what are the take messages for you? The first one is the fight and the win. I mean, don't fight with nature because it's going to win unless you destroy it, and then we are going to lose. But essentially, the diversity of nature limits the machine learning and the big data applications. And therefore, if we want to really understand and to do sustainability, this human environmental interactions is essential, and time as a primitive and events as a concept for that are important there. Big data is different because it allows us to do continuous monitoring of the landscape, something that it would be very difficult to do when we have just one data set. And essentially, we would then look at trajectories of land as events, more carefully speaking, they are measurements of events. And therefore, you can recognize events in big data sets. And they are in some respects, more important than just identifying individual objects. In some cases, it's more important to understand what has changed, when it has changed, how it has changed, how it has evolved, then look at each individual object there, and then do the change later. These are, I'm not saying that these are, one is the best, but they are complementary. A lot of the discussion that I'm presenting to you today is contained and better explained on a recent paper that just been published in the Journal of Spatial Information Science. The paper is called On the Semantics of Big Earth Observation for Land Classification, which is more or less the title of the talk. And I'd like to close by coming up from research agenda, which includes conceptual and non-conceptual. This is not specifically for you as an audience, but in general. But essentially, one of the problems that we have is this idea of identifying samples that account to this variation. And it goes without saying that that needs local knowledge. So capturing local knowledge, representing this knowledge is an open problem. Recognizing events in big data is an open problem. Reasoning with events, again, tough. What's the best way to interact with big data? There's a typical problem of doing what we would programmers would call an API, because many of, let's say, some of what the things that we have done for deduction and some of the examples seen using all and RDFs and similar things, they are not really, time is not really there. And this is one of the issues that when we move to the Earth's environment, time is of the essence. So we need good conceptual models there. And obviously, we all have to worry about how to share them, how to develop and share robust open source tools, and in the end, make these technologies useful to support sound environmental policies, which is, of course, the end of it all, in the sense that we are facing, besides the COVID, a huge climate crisis where action is highly and urgently needed. So I would like to thank Giancarlo for this nice invitation, and I'm pleased to answer any questions you might have.